Hello and welcome to the online launch of the latest report from the Bankwest Curtin Economics Centre, Behind the Line, Poverty and Disadvantage in Australia 2022. Before we get into today's program, we'll take a moment for a welcome to country by Emeritus Professor Simon Forrest, Whadjuk Noongar Elder and Curtin University Fellow.
Kaya Wanju. Hello and welcome. My name is Simon Forrest Burungu. I'm a Whadjuk Baladong Noongar with kin connections to Yamaji and Wongai peoples. I am of this land and place. I follow a bloodline of people who have walked and cared for this land for over 40,000 years. This is a welcome to country, a welcome to Whadjuk Noongar Buja. A welcome to country recognises and acknowledges us and the first and continuing custodians of this land, Australia. Nidja Bolo, Nidja Kunkungap, Nidja Margarap, Nidja Mindarap. Kaya Wanju, Nan Kwel, Simon Forrest Burungu. Kaya Wanju, Nidja Whadjuk Noongar Buja, Nal Karich Noongar Mod, Ken Karat Nidja Buja, Nan Karich Noongar Kabali, Morankoriye.
Once again, hello and welcome to the launch of Behind the Line, Poverty and Disadvantage in Australia 2022. My name is Jane Caro. You may know me as an author, broadcaster and social commentator. I'm a bit of a stirrer, but I have always been very concerned about poverty and disadvantage, so I'm delighted to be invited to facilitate this launch. It's something that's really near to my heart. I'd also, of course, like to thank Simon Forrest, Whadjuk Noongar Elder and Curtin University Fellow, for his really beautiful and powerful welcome to country. I would also like to acknowledge the elders of the land on which I'm sitting, the Dja Dja Wurrung and Tora Gurung peoples of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Now, on to the reason that we're all here. Behind the Line, Poverty and Disadvantage in Australia, which is a brand new focus on the States report by Bankwest Economics Centre, examining the prevalence of poverty within Australia, how it's changed over time, and which groups in our society face the greatest risks of financial hardship and material deprivation. Look, this is an important topic, and as I said, it's one that I've been concerned about and interested in for a very long time. So I am very excited, a little bit trepidatious perhaps, to explore this new research with you all today. And, you know, I hope you're all looking forward to it, as I say, with a bit of trepidation, as much as I am. But before we begin, there's always a little bit of housekeeping. So bear with me as I take you through the schedule for today's event. First things first, if you're going to tweet anything or make any comments on social media, don't forget to use the hashtag poverty2022, and the Twitter handle is @BankwestCurtin. And just to run through the schedule, firstly, we'll hear some brief opening remarks from Jason Chan, the new Executive General Manager of Bankwest. Then we'll hear from John Curtin Distinguished Professor Alan Duncan, Director of the Bankwest Curtin Economics Centre, and he's the lead author of the report, and he will present the report's key findings. And following that, I will be facilitating a discussion with our expert panel, consisting of Dr. Cassandra Goldie, CEO, as long as she gets to the lounge quickly enough to hook up her computer, because she's just landed on a plane, which I think is above and beyond the call of duty. Good for you, Cassandra. I mean, not being on a plane, but rushing to get to this as you get off it. She is, of course, the CEO of the Australian Council of Social Services. Lynn Hatfield-Dodds, CEO of the Benevolence Society. Kate O'Hara, CEO Food Bank WA. And Mike Rowe, Director General, Department of Communities WA. Once we've had the panel discussion, we'll move to an audience Q&A session with the panel. This is where you get the chance to ask the panel your own questions. We'd love to hear from you. So please submit your questions freely and often. And you can ask them at any time during today's stream using the dedicated Q&A box on your device. Look for the little square with the 2 speech bubbles and the question mark on your device to access the conversation and ask your questions. You can choose to remain anonymous when submitting a question if you wish by ticking the anonymous box. You can also direct your question to a specific panelist by writing that into your question. So this is for Lynn, etc. If you wish to do this when sending your question, just put the name in as I just said. Now, let's get started. The first thing we're doing is welcoming Jason Chan, Executive General Manager of Bankwest. Welcome, Jason.
Thanks, Jane. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm located today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. With this event open to audiences across Australia, in the spirit of reconciliation, I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. I pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people today. Hi, I'm Jason Chan, the new Executive General Manager at Bankwest. It's my pleasure to welcome you all today to the first Bankwest Curtin Economics Centre event of the year, as we will launch the Poverty and Disadvantage in Australia 2022 report. I was delighted to hear that one of my first official duties was to help launch this report. I know how valued these reports are with their unique insights into issues relevant in WA and across Australia. Our support for the Bankwest Curtin Economics Centre is approaching its 10th year, and it forms part of our ongoing support for the communities and economies in which we operate. The social and economic research produced by the Centre is helping inform and shape debate and public policy on critical issues impacting our nation. Bankwest has been part of the fabric of Western Australia for more than 125 years, and today we are as committed as ever to building a brighter future for all. We're committed to being there for our 1.1 million customers across Australia when they need us most, particularly the more vulnerable and those facing financial difficulty. Sadly, some of our customers face this adversity every day, so it's important we work through their individual circumstances with care and empathy to ensure we support them in the best way possible. I hope you'll agree that this report is both incredibly timely and important, as it explores the themes of poverty and disadvantage, topics that are so critical to keep front of mind for any economically and culturally strong country. Reflecting on the unprecedented events of the last 2 years and the global events unfolding today, we are truly incredibly lucky to live in a country like Australia. As a son of immigrants myself, I believe we each have a role to play in creating a society based on equality and respect so that no one gets left behind. So thank you to Professor Alan Duncan and your team for this report, and to the expert panelists for joining us today. I very much look forward to hearing from you all shortly and the discussion that follows. So thank you.
And thank you, Jason, for your remarks. Next, we need to welcome John Curtin Distinguished Professor Alan Duncan, Director of the Bankwest Curtin Economics Centre, as he presents the findings from this report, Behind the Line, Poverty and Disadvantage in Australia 2022. Please welcome Alan.
Thanks, Jane, and thanks everyone for joining us today from wherever you are for BCC's Behind the Line report. Let me add my acknowledgements and thanks to the traditional owners of the lands that we're meeting on across the country, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'm speaking to you from the beautiful lands of the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation. I could also pass my thoughts and best wishes to the people in Queensland and New South Wales, having to deal with such terrible floods over the few weeks that we've seen up till now. So the health and well-being of any society is a key parameter, not just of a nation's prosperity, but of its compassion and core values. And many like to think Australia is just that, a land of opportunity. A land where the country has your back, where everyone gets a fair go. But it's hard to reconcile this picture with a society in which people still suffer from deep and persistent disadvantage, and where they continue to struggle and fall behind. In this report, we explore the extent of poverty and disadvantage in Australia and how it's changed from pre-COVID levels. But we also look behind the poverty line to explore how the experience of poverty impacts on people's quality of life, social isolation, their security and well-being. We consider how significant life events such as separation or bereavement affect the risk of poverty for women and men, and how long these effects persist. Our research explores the challenges faced by women across the course of their lives, and we examine how adverse life events affect women's economic security. So what does poverty in Australia look like, and how do we measure it? Well, most research takes the typical or the median income in Australia as a reference point against which to calculate the poverty line. The standard poverty line is 50% of the typical or median equivalent income once housing costs have been paid for and once households of different sizes have been catered for as well. And for 2020, we calculate the 50% median poverty line for a single person to be $453.50 per week after housing costs. A couple with no children would need $680 to be out of poverty. And that's the equivalent of $340 per person, which of course is cheaper than the single person poverty line because it's generally cheaper to live as two people than one, not least because of shared housing costs. But in this report, we also take care to look at the prevalence of deeper poverty where people survive on under 30% of the median income. And in 2020, that came to only $272 per week once housing costs have been covered. Our analysis reveals that just under 3 million people in Australia live in income poverty as defined by the 50% median poverty line. This represents nearly 11.8% of the population and includes nearly 750,000 children. And around 1 million people face severe income poverty, living on less than $272 a week, as I say, once housing costs have been catered for. Now, we do find that poverty has fallen on the standard measure by around 350,000 between 2019 and 2020. And of course, that will have been driven partly by the COVID-19 supports that were paid through government allowances and wage subsidies. Yet some contrasting patterns when we look at changes in poverty across states and territories over the last decade. New South Wales has improved fairly consistently over the last 10 years, with poverty rates dropping to 11.4% by 2020. Victoria has maintained rates of around 11% for most of the decade. Rates have risen gradually in Queensland and more strongly in Northern Territories. And for Western Australia, the rate of poverty reduced over the first half of the last decade, but has increased over the 6 years since to around 12.8% in 2020. Being single substantially increases the risk of poverty, whether or not you have kids. In fact, single parents and single people are continuously overrepresented throughout all poverty depth groups. More than a quarter of single parents and single adults are in poverty according to the standard definition in the red bars here. And around 1 in 10 single parents and more than 1 in 8 single adults experience severe poverty in the light blue bars. Rates are generally lower for couples, around 8.9% for people in couple-only households, and for couples with children, the figure is even lower at 7.4%. And our report reveals a gender gap in poverty that's more pronounced for young women and women approaching retirement, the gold schedule here. Single women aged 55 and over who live in private rental accommodation are particularly exposed to financial hardship, with 2/3 experiencing income poverty. Joblessness and long-term unemployment has long presented a challenge, and a difficult one, in the design of effective policy. More than half of non-working single parents experience poverty, on the left in red, and for single people, the rates are even higher, at over 60%. Poverty rates are typically over 40% for jobless families with children, in blue on the right, whether the parents are unemployed or whether they are not in the labour force. But the payoff from reducing the number of people in the deepest or most persistent financial hardship would be considerable, and it remains a priority for coordinated state and federal programmes to tackle issues of severe and persistent hardship amongst jobless households. So did the job seeker coronavirus supplement reduce poverty? Yes, it did. Poverty among the unemployed fell by 6 percentage points to under 25% among respondents to the HILDA survey used in this report, who were interviewed to the end of September 2020. That was when the COVID supplement was at $550. Poverty then increased nearly 8 percentage points for those interviewed to the end of 2020, when the supplement was cut to $250. And again, poverty went up when the supplement dropped further to $150. And do bear in mind that these measures are based on respondents' incomes over the whole year, while the extra COVID support only covered part of the year. But that was then, and this is now. It's all too easy to get stuck into semantics about poverty lines or how poverty is calculated. So to get back to basics, here's some maths. You're single and you're out of work. Your job seeker payment is worth $314.75 a week. And Commonwealth Rent Assistance pays a maximum of $71.40 for any rent above $159 a week. So that's a combined $386 plus change each week for you to live off. Now, it's virtually impossible to find anywhere in the private rental market for $250 per week. But let's say you do. That means you have $136 left to live off each week once your rent has been paid. And when your rent allowance is already maxed out, that means that every extra dollar your rent goes up is $1 less you have to spend on everything else: food, bills, and transport. That's every dollar, or every $20, or every $50. It's hard to see how that can be thought of as remotely adequate. At least on our definition, you're in severe poverty. That's when your weekly income is less than $272, whenever you're in this sort of situation. And this is why we see there to be an urgent need for reform. And from our modelling, if one were to add $20 per day onto the job seeker single base rate, combine that with a 30% increase in the maximum CRA, that would go a long way to eliminating instances of severe poverty in Australia. And do we see this sort of scenario playing out? Have rising housing costs fed into higher poverty rates among people in the private rental market? Well, yes, they have. Nearly a quarter of people in private rentals and more than half of those in social housing fell below the poverty line in 2020. But poverty rates for private renters increased by 2.2 percentage points over 2 years, while the rate for those in social housing has reduced by 6.7 percentage points. Financial hardship is especially severe for older single people in the private rental sector, with 2/3 of single women aged 55 and over, and a half of older single men in poverty by our definition. The social housing is one of the most important levers at the disposal of state and territory governments in the fight against poverty. And it shows just how important social housing is as a way to provide housing security to those in deepest financial hardship, but also as a basis for economic and social participation. We can see pretty clearly the drivers of those rising poverty rates when you look at the private rental market. This is a chart that shows rental costs over around 10 years for a typical 3-bedroomed house. And we find rent to have increased over the last 2 years in Sydney by around $30, also in Canberra, and by $50 or more in Perth and Darwin. And the same pattern is true when you look at those renting at the lower price points. And of course, rents have also risen even higher in some regional centres where we have a combination of low vacancy rates and high demand. And the rise in rental costs has inevitably put more pressure on many families in meeting their housing costs, especially those that are either out of work or reliant on government payments as their main source of income. The data that we used in this report, the Household Income and Labour Dynamics in Australia survey, the HILDA survey, tracks people over the course of time and asks whether or not they have not been able to pay their housing bills. And according to those data, nearly 170,000 more people weren't able to pay for their house, majority of whom are either in part-time work or not in the labour force. 270,000 part-time workers were unable to meet housing costs in 2020, up 83,000 on a year earlier, and housing stress has been growing consistently for people who are either unemployed or not in the labour force, with a combined 410,000 now struggling with housing costs. So I think it's pretty clear that the recent rental cost increases have to be a major contributor to poverty and hardship. I want to turn now to the issues around working poverty and how changes in labour force status have affected poverty rates over the course of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, poverty is certainly a challenge mainly faced by people without jobs, but there's a surprising share of people in Australia who are both in work and in poverty. Around 8.8% of people classed as poor in 2020 were in full-time work, and 10.8% of the poor had part-time jobs. So taken together, nearly 1 in 5 of the poor are working. And the prevalence of working poverty does vary by industry sector. We find that around 1 in 8 workers in the agriculture sector earn below the poverty line, and 1 in 10 people working in accommodation and food or hospitality services have the same challenge. Now, 2020 was the year that saw the introduction of the JobKeeper wage subsidy. This provided $750 per week for qualifying workers in businesses that took a hit of 30% or more in lost turnover. Some exclusions apply, particularly short-term casual workers, but this chart nevertheless shows how much the wage subsidy benefited workers on casual contracts. The rate of working poverty for casual workers in 2019 was 12.4% in the gold bar here. In 2020, poverty rates fell to 9.4% amongst workers for whom no JobKeeper payments were claimed, in blue, but dropped to a much lower 5.6% for casual workers in companies that qualified for and claimed JobKeeper, in red. And of course, this was largely due to the fact that the $750 per week subsidy had to be passed on entirely to qualifying workers, even those that were paid less than $750 per week before the pandemic. But there was a bit of a twist in the JobKeeper tale. The wage subsidy certainly lifted more casual workers out of working poverty. Poverty rates fell for part-time workers across the board, but working poverty actually rose to 8.5% for full-time fixed-term workers in companies that qualified for JobKeeper, and fell to 3% for full-time fixed-term workers in companies that didn't qualify. So it does look that there's been a degree of substitution and restructuring of hours across the workforce for companies that qualified for the subsidy. Now, the HILDA survey I mentioned earlier that forms the basis, the information basis for this report, fortunately gives us a chance to track people's work status over time. And that can give us some highly relevant information on the composition of the unemployed. We separate the stock of unemployed in 2019 and 2020 by their labour force status the year before. And we found that 180,000 people moved from full-time work into unemployment in 2020. That's triple the rate for 2019. So the pandemic has clearly led to a growing class of newly unemployed people who may well be experiencing unemployment for the first time in their lives. And of course, they carry commitments that align with their previous work status. And they may be entirely unfamiliar with the situation of not having a job. We need to ensure that there are systems in place to address the immediate service needs of the newly unemployed, including measures to quickly reconnect with the labour market. This will be both beneficial to those people, but also economically highly efficient. Now, so far, we've looked at patterns and trends in poverty and how COVID-19 has affected the number of people below a poverty line. But what's behind the line? How does the experience of poverty affect people's experience of life, their health, and their outlook? The HILDA survey we use in our research includes a host of indicators that record people's attitudes to their quality of life, their security, their health, and their sense of well-being. And we wanted to capture whether or not there were broader themes from these responses that could provide a framework in shaping economic and social policy initiatives. We applied a purely statistical technique to the many indicators of financial and social well-being collected in the HILDA survey. And it's just amazing how clearly and relatably the data spoke to the vulnerabilities of people experiencing poverty and hardship. Three broad domains of vulnerability emerged. We found a really tight cluster related to financial vulnerabilities and deprivations, not being able to afford meals or pay bills or heat your home, but also the critical need for advice and support. We found a grouping that relates to emotional vulnerabilities and social exclusion. This is a strong theme with loneliness, isolation, and a lack of people to confide in featuring in that cluster. And a third domain emerged that spoke to people's sense of housing insecurity, not just affordability, but their feelings of safety, a lack of satisfaction with their local environment. On the basis of these groupings, we're able to track whether or not the markers of vulnerability and hardship change over the course of 2019 through 2020. We do find that they did change. More than 1 in 12 of those people who fell below the poverty line in 2020 went without meals in that year. That's 2.8 times the rate for all families. 16% asked for financial help, twice the rate of people not in poverty, and 15% were not able to pay their bills. But we did find that the situation improved to a degree in 2020 compared with 2019. Share of people who went without meals fell by 2.3 percentage points in 2020. Fewer people couldn't pay the bills and fewer people asked for financial help. And of course, this has to do with the extra COVID supports available during 2020, but it's also important to say that the HILDA survey predates the more recent rises in living costs. And so this trend may not be reflective of the current situation, especially now that the extra financial supports during the COVID-19 pandemic are no longer available. The journey into poverty can be triggered by a life event that substantially changes a person's financial situation and outlook. This could be when people suffer a relationship breakdown, or the death of a partner, or when people lose their jobs or they retire. Each of these life transitions, of course, will have a profound impact on people's personal well-being, but they can also bring about a significant change in financial circumstances. But which life events most affect the journey into hardship? Who is affected the most, and how long do those effects endure? One of the great opportunities afforded by using the Hilda survey is that we can track life events and relate them to measures of financial hardship, and we find that the risk of moving into poverty is 3 times higher for women than for men following separation or divorce, and nearly twice as high following the death of a partner. And the effects endure for separations that happened 3 or more years ago. Retirement increases the risk of moving into poverty both for women and men in the first year, but not so much after, and the loss of a job comes out as much more transitional, but severe over the first period of unemployment. You can see that it increases the chance of moving into poverty by 3.2% percentage points for women and 5.7 percentage points for men. But as I say, it pretty much entirely disappears after the first year. So the overall take-homes here are pretty clear. The risks of being pushed into poverty when relationships break down are both more severe and more enduring for women. And women also suffer adverse impacts from divorce or separation for longer. Our report also shows that people who face persistent poverty are more likely to experience psychological distress, and the longer the time in poverty, the worse the mental health impacts are. And the psychological trauma from years in poverty rises more steeply for women than for men at most ages and family settings. But the escalation is especially acute for single women aged under 55, 40% of whom experience high psychological distress from having been in poverty for at least 3 years. More than a third of single parent women who've been in poverty for between 3 and 5 years suffered from elevated levels of stress, and the figure rises further when poverty persists for at least 6 years. So in both cases, the rate of mental stress from persistent poverty is felt more severely for women than for men. And before closing with some remarks, I really need to show you just how far the effects of poverty extend, and also for how long those impacts last. We compare a series of outcomes for young adults who experienced poverty during childhood, matched against similar adults who had no experience of financial hardship at the home. The chances of securing future employment after poverty in childhood we find to be up to 11 percentage points lower compared to those that did not come from a poor childhood background. And people who experience childhood poverty are up to 80 percentage points more likely to remain in poverty in adult life. They're also more likely to suffer from nervousness or feel unhappy with their life for up to 10 years after leaving the family home. So this shows just how much the effects of poverty in childhood stay with people as they move into adulthood. But it also shows the economic return from targeting poverty to go alongside the positive social, psychological and health benefits of so doing. I believe there are some really important findings in the research presented today. But ultimately, it's another in a long line of poverty reports. Lynn very kindly, effectively gave this call to me to reflect on what it all means. Why should we care? And what should we do? Well, we hope that by looking behind the line, the relevance to each of us in targeting poverty is clear. Poverty is and should always remain a critical issue for Australia, but this report's about more than that. It's about fairness and equity. It's about narrowing the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. It's about making sure our children have the best opportunities to reach their potential. It's about economic efficiency and the effective delivery of public service. And if you already care about gender equity and women's economic security, then you should care about poverty because it impacts disproportionately on women. And that's why this report includes a number of recommendations that we reckon can really shift the dial. And we hope they'll be considered seriously by policymakers. Some of these considerations no doubt present challenges or raise questions of cost. For example, the critics of the idea of lifting the Commonwealth rent assistance maximum, they suggest that it's too expensive, or it could feed through into higher market rents. or that more people would be brought into the CRA, or that some would get the CRA that aren't in housing stress. These are details. If there are problems, then surely it's better to find a solution rather than use the solution as a reason for doing nothing. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Alan, for those very sobering figures and your insights about them. Now we're going to get into our panel discussion. And before we do, I'll reintroduce the panellists to you. I believe we have Dr. Cassandra Goldie, Chief Executive Officer of the Australian Council of Social Service. Is Cassandra there? Just somebody let me know.
Jane, that you can hear me and you can see
me. I can. Cassandra has landed. The eagle has landed. That's good.
Lovely.
Or possibly I could say Cassandra is in the building, but she isn't. Most of us aren't. We're elsewhere. Our next panellist is Lynn Hatfield-Dodds. She is the Chief Executive Officer of the Benevolence Society, and she's definitely here. And Kate O'Hara, Chief Executive Officer of Food Bank Western Australia. And of course, Mike Rowe, Director General, Department of Communities, Western Australia. Thanks to you all for being here today and taking part in discussing this very important report. I'd like to begin by asking my first question to you, Cassandra, if that's all right. And that is, do you think poverty is a truly complex issue? What are the structural policy settings that can reduce the number of Australians experiencing poverty? Can you answer that in just a couple of minutes?
Thanks, Jane. Can I just acknowledge that I am thrilled to be on Noongar country. I can't tell you how emotional I am. I have literally just got, this is the airport behind me. I'm actually literally sitting on the ground and it feels a very, very special place to be. And to thank Simon for welcome to country and to see you all. And I didn't want to miss this because congratulations, Alan and the team at Bankwest Curtin for producing this report, because until we've ended poverty, we need to keep telling the story. And it's so important that you are again coming through with this kind of analysis. What's so important about it, Jane, I think as another colleague, we've done a lot of work on this issue. It's at our core purpose at ACOS to end poverty in Australia. But first of all, the findings from this report are very complementary to the work that we do with the UNSW colleagues, you know well, Alan, and you work collaboratively with them. What it highlights, Jane, firstly, as one of the wealthiest countries in the world, and we're the second wealthiest, actually, after Switzerland when it comes to by median household wealth. We have historically had a persistent level of poverty going into the pandemic. We've had about 3 million people living in poverty, very similar, Alan, to your findings. And about 750,000 children. And what was really profound in the 2020 period is that with the government and Treasury listening to the experts, all of us who had been saying, give more income to people who really need it, who will spend it straight away on things that will help them and others to stay in jobs by lifting up JobSeeker, the coronavirus supplement. We ended poverty for people who'd been living it for far too long, and for people who were falling out of jobs on a daily basis, we protected them from poverty as well. The poverty rates would have been twice as high, Jane, if those interventions had not happened. And what it showed is that we absolutely can end poverty. Poverty is at its heart a lack of resources. I mean, everybody understands about wages, about, you know, the struggle to get an increase in your wages. Well, it's about income adequacy, and the crucial lever to fix that is our social security system. No surprises there. If you don't have paid work, you need to have a safety net, and that is income support. And Alan, again, the findings show that, you know, the key groups who have been so devastatingly affected by inadequacy in social security have been people who are out of the paid work environment, on job seeker, people who are single parents, older women. Jane, you know this so well. And the other part is, what's your biggest cost? What's so important to your sense of security and safety is housing. And so Mike, there are two big levers to us to fix the adequacy of the income support system. And that is a key federal responsibility. There's no question. And the other big lever is social housing. And as a community sector, I know we'll talk more about, you know, some of the more complex questions about disadvantage. If we delivered those as the safety nets to secure those who've got the least, much more would be done to be able to support people elevated out of the severe financial distress that comes through when you're constantly worrying about whether or not you can feed yourself, whether you can look after your kids, the new shoes, all of those really basic essentials of life. And so this is not complex. Can I highlight that anybody who says they don't think money's the solution to poverty probably has never actually walked down the supermarket and worked out how they're going to put a meal together for their kids on less than $5, you know, for the week, because that is the experience, and it's money that will make the difference for people. Thanks, Jane.
Thank you, Cassandra. Yes, anyone who says money doesn't matter has got an awful lot of it, in my experience. Okay, they're the only people who think it doesn't matter, because it doesn't matter to them. They've got plenty. Our next question is for you, Lynn. Should people care about poverty? I mean, it's obvious Cassandra cares about it. It's obvious Alan cares about it. I care about it. But why should, you know, most ordinary Australians going about their business care about it? And can a report like this one make a difference to whether they care about it or not?
Thanks very much. I'll start by paying my respects to the traditional owners of the country that I'm on today. I'm on the country of the people of the Yuin Nation down on the south coast of New South Wales at the moment. I think this report's a really important one, and having reports like this that give us data points and clear ways forward to addressing poverty and the impacts of inequality are really important. Why would you care about poverty if you don't always care? So if you already care about poverty, you probably have known and loved people who've struggled with making ends meet and with living it tough. If you don't know those people and you don't currently care, if you want to talk to people who don't currently care about poverty, something I think that wealthy Australians are not very well aware of is that poverty and high levels of inequality actually hurt everybody in a country. And that evidence has been in for more than 30 years now. There's OECD, there's World Bank, there's Deakin University studies. I just looked up a few again this morning to check my facts. But the reality is that all of us are worse off when some of us are struggling. So if you don't care about poverty at the moment because you don't have that a well of empathy and compassion for other people, that's okay. You might want to care about it because it's going to impact you yourself. Inequality depresses economic growth. It makes the economic pie smaller for everybody. So each of our share is going to shrink. And you see that as you look around the globe. And the main mechanism that this happens, of course, is through reduced educational opportunities for poor kids and poor adults. It lowers their social mobility, it lowers their skills development, so they're less productive employees, which means lower wages, which means lower overall participation in the economy. And Cassandra said, you know, if we can in Australia, through moments like bushfires or floods or COVID, provide short-term payments for Australians, and we see that money flows straight into the economy. They're not putting it into stocks and shares. They're not buying houses with it. They're buying disposable goods. It is the cleverest economic way to get the economy moving again. That's why the Treasury keeps advising governments to kind of go down this path. If we can do that when we're in crisis, why can't we do it to benefit all of us all of the time, so we lift the whole? So that's my first point. The second point I want to make is just, we can fix poverty if we want to. This is a doing challenge, not a knowing problem. All the evidence is in, we know exactly what we need to do. And Alan and Cassandra have talked about some of the things we need to do: health, mental health, housing, skills, participation in work. All those things are important. all of us could talk about them till the cows come home, but every public servant in this country understands to their bones what to do to eliminate poverty and inequality. What we need, I think, all of us, is to think about electing politicians that want to go after poverty and inequality. Thanks.
Thank you, Lynn. Absolutely. There's also research, I think, that shows that the bigger the inequality gap in a society, the more violent the society is and the more crime there is. So, in fact, if we reduced poverty and closed the gap, we'd all be safer, happier, and able to go about our business better.
And all the strategies we have are all terribly evidence-based, and they're win-win. You know, everybody thrives, and we boost productivity and growth. So that's suiting both the left and the right. We can all agree on it. Let's just do it.
Feels very mean-spirited sometimes, doesn't it? My next question is for Kate. Kate, what would you say to people that don't think food insecurity is real in WA and wealthy, lucky WA? What would you say to them?
I'd actually say come and stand in our Perth branch. But before I go into what we see on the front line, again, thank you everyone for bringing this together from the BCEC, incredible platform to deal with the reality of what is happening in our West Australian community, which I'll speak to. But look, across the nation, the food banks across the nation are seeing significant changes in who's presenting. So when people say to me, I don't believe there's anybody that is facing poverty or dealing with food stress, then really it literally is come and see for yourself, because we are seeing numbers that are unprecedented. And as much as there is very low levels of unemployment, the points that have been made in the presentation around the working poor are very, very real. And all of the data presented is reflected in the profiles of those people that are coming to us for assistance through the 6 branches, 26 metro locations. We're now extending metro mobile deliveries into the regional areas. So our ability to reach community has grown, and it's the working poor that are coming forward, and they look like you and I and everybody else tuning in. The reality of households struggling to put their budget to best use and the financial stress means that we are thrilled to be able to support them and present them with very, very cost-effective food. Because once you deal with the food issue, then you really need to be able to support them in that space so that they can spend their remaining budget they've got in other areas, because food is the first thing that gets cut from everything we see. So if they don't have to spend $250, $300 on their food and they can spend $50, it makes a big difference in the decision making around housing and paying power bills and all the other costs of life. So it's a mismatch is our understanding, and we see the waves come in very, very quickly as people were choosing to not get vaccinated and leave their careers. Some of those started to present. As soon as JobKeeper and JobSeeker turned off, it was like a hockey stick towards Christmas with the amount of people coming forward, and it's our privilege to serve them. We're here for anybody who gets referred, so we're very, very happy to provide that service, and we can do more. But it's about them presenting for it so that they can manage their budgets, and essentially we want that community to not fall into the trap of losing their housing and then fall into those other problems that present themselves around decisions in life. So when there's food stress, we know it compounds on those other factors, and that's when the government services really get the heat. So if we can stop the cycle and keep people in homes, keep people making great decisions about nutrition, then we can help impact on the whole of community, just as we've been speaking to, because poverty is here in WA, no question. Poverty is impacting people who have never been unemployed before, households that never want to reveal to their neighbours that they're struggling, and it may be in a transition period. So we are hoping what we're doing now for this market that's coming forward and dealing with an issue of poverty, we're hoping we're empowering them through change so they can make not just better buying decisions, we also want to make sure they're making great food choices and how they're cooking and feeding for their families. So education is very important in this. And we think everybody knows how to cook right, but you know, buying the fast food meal option might seem cheap, but when you realise the nutritional value, it's a real issue. So you want to make sure our people and households under stress are eating well, because when you're eating well, so much else goes well. So it's really important that people understand and see the front line of this growing working poor. And I tell you, we'd welcome anybody who wants to come, and any of the decision makers and leaders in business and others that want to understand and appreciate what is really happening, please come visit. We would love to help you understand exactly the points of what's been discussed throughout the morning.
Thanks, Kate. I think that's an invitation lots of people should take up. It's interesting you talk about housing, and it's come up a few times. I actually spoke at the Ahuri conference yesterday, so that brings us quite nicely to Mike. And from the report, we can see that social housing is an important part of the solution to ending poverty. I mean, as Cassandra said, if you've got a roof over your head, you've got that sense of safety and security. You've also got somewhere to cook that nutritional food that Kate was talking about. What is the WA state government doing about providing social housing for those who need it?
Well, hello, Jane, and hello, everybody. It's really wonderful to be with you. Like others, particularly here in beautiful Perth, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining today from Wajak Noongar Budja, and I pay my deep respects to the traditional owners and elders, past and present, also extending, of course, my respect to elders all over our great nation. So congratulations to everybody involved in producing this report. As we've pointed out, it's really clear from the research that housing cost plays a significant role in the level of poverty faced by many Australians. And as Alan has said, with those in severe poverty living on as little as $150 a week after housing costs. So the state government's priority is to see as many Western Australians as possible in safe and secure homes, recognising that obviously it's a simple human need and one which can contribute to moving people out of poverty. What are we doing about it? We've got a strategy which guides our work in that space. It sets out clear targets for our housing system and what we want into the future. And more recently, there's been very significant funding injections by the state government into social and affordable housing in Western Australia. So our most recent budget saw an additional $875 million being injected into social housing, which brings our budget that my department manages for social housing to around $2.1 billion over the next 4 years. And that will see us deliver an additional 3,300 social housing dwellings. So we've got some challenges in WA, like we do in other places, in delivering that in a timely way. We've got obviously a skilled workforce, or the lack thereof, supply chain issues and challenges associated with getting products that we need to build the houses, and the impact of natural disasters such as cyclones, erosion and other things. And of course, COVID-19 is with us. So it is a struggle to get those houses done, but we're trying very hard to do it. We are trying to get more availability of social housing generally. Cassandra mentioned, and welcome back, Cassandra, it's good to see you back in Perth, that obviously it is a partnership between the Commonwealth and the state government. The Commonwealth obviously has the income levers in many cases. State government has a significant role to play in social and affordable housing, and it's something that we're very proud to be able to deliver. One of the other things that the report focused on was the fact that that poverty impacts women more than men, and there's very large differences in rates of poverty for young women and women aged 55 years and over. And that shows out as well in our wait list. So we've got a wait list of about 18,000 people in Western Australia. Now, clearly, that, just to be clear, that doesn't mean 18,000 people don't have a roof over their head, but it could be that we've got 18,000 people who want to change their housing type for whatever reason. And what we see actually is that the largest number of people who want new housing is typically singles, single women both and men, but single women typically in the older and in the younger age brackets. So clearly that's the kind of the trend that we're seeing in terms of people experiencing poverty who are looking for a roof over their heads, and they may not be happy with what they have at the moment, or they may not be able to afford what they have in the rental market, which is the other point that Alan made in his report. We also know, of course, that single parents and older women are particularly vulnerable to economic impacts that place upward pressure on housing and rental affordability. So we need targeted strategies that focus on early intervention rather than crisis response to help those people maintain or access housing appropriate to their needs. We've actually got a whole of government and a whole of community organisation strategy around homelessness, which we're really proud over here. That's called All Paths Lead to Home, and it really sets the direction for how we're going to invest and try and direct effort to solving particularly our front-facing homelessness problem in Western Australia, where we have obviously street-present people, as other people do. Little examples of some innovation around what's happening with particularly supporting women in that cohort. So in August last year, the government partnered through Lottery West and provided funding to deliver 18 prefabricated houses to assist women over the age of 55 who are experiencing homelessness. And that was a partnership between St Patrick's Community Support Centre, which is just around the corner here in Freo, and My Home Australasia. And they'll deliver high quality architect designed homes and facilitate wraparound support services for vulnerable residents. It's the first of a kind for here in Western Australia. It probably happens in other places, but those are the sorts of examples of where there's good collaboration by both the state government and other not-for-profit sectors to support vulnerable Western Australians. Gender inequality is also a key driver of gendered violence and harassment, and that obviously has devastating impacts on women and children. And as we know, when women are unsafe at their workplaces or in their homes, their options to build financial security are absolutely eroded. So supporting women in building financial security is also, I think, key to overcoming poverty and disadvantage, and we support a range of initiatives in that space. And they range from the big issue Women's Subscription Enterprise Project, which is an initiative for women who've experienced disadvantage, empowering them to build self-esteem, job retaining scheme for women in refuges, which aims to build the capacity of women and reduce the barriers, as well as grants program for women, which women supports experiencing homelessness to find employment. So I guess just wrapping up, acknowledging that it is International Women's Day on the Tuesday, the 8th of March. We've celebrated, acknowledged that for over 100 years, and there's no question that more needs to be done to ensure that women and girls everywhere have the same protection, rights and access to economic and social participation. This year's theme of Break the Bias is a call to action. It targets our unconscious bias and to be more assertive in the workplace and social settings to challenge the status quo. And if we don't challenge these misconceptions, we know the likely outcome, and given that that's the topic of today's report. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today. Social housing is absolutely part of the solution to resolving poverty.
Thanks, Mike. Yes, I had dinner with an old friend a couple of nights ago. She's living in poverty, and she said that she felt as if something was broken inside her. Awful. Okay, my final question for this section of the panel goes to our report author, Alan. Alan, you talk about job seeker and Commonwealth rent assistance as both being increased to lift up to 1 million Australians out of poverty. What a fantastic achievement. Why is it important to increase both of them to get the desired result?
Thanks, Jane. I'll very briefly, because I'm really keen to hear sort of the open Q&A, but I guess just from the perspective of, you know, there's a greater degree of efficiency in targeting, it's very hard to respond to two issues with one instrument. So we got this situation of, you know, elevated housing costs. We've seen that, you know, in the data. We've seen that, and I think in people's experiences. Of course, that potentially can ebb and flow. But we're also seeing high cost of living, you know, of course, you know, especially with, you know, the situation at the moment internationally, and, you know, more generally the escalating cost of living, to try and tailor a response to be able to manage all of those things at the same time, for me, I think merits more than a reform to a single policy. And so I think that's the basic reason why I see, you know, managing the sort of the two reforms, I think would be a way of approaching this in a more efficient way. And of course, I laid out some of the challenges that are there before us in the debates around lifting the maximum rate of CRA. But I think those challenges must have some solutions. Going back to the basics, I think is very clear for all to see.
Thank you, Alan. And now we get to the part where we answer the questions from those who are watching us. There are already some great questions that have come through. Just a reminder, you can continue to send in any questions you may have using the live event Q&A section on your device, that little box with the question mark speech bubble in it. And remember, if you have a question for a specific panel member, please write question for Cassandra or Alan, or just put their name in it. It's quicker, and I'll work it out. Okay, let's get on to our first question, which has been here since the beginning. So let's get to it. It's from Anonymous, and I think this one probably should go to Kate. What are the most effective ways state governments can ensure that children and teens facing disadvantage never go hungry and always get enough nutrition? What do you think, Kate?
Wow, big question. But the reality of food and its role for children, particularly in that first 1,000 days, we know is really critical for their long-term health. And we know that the programs, we've got a great partnership with government and the school breakfast program. So a long-standing program, we know it has well-researched evidence and impacts, and it's really important for the state. And that goes out to about half the schools that reach a certain qualification. So the government does provide great support into a school system, and that ensures that breakfast is delivered to households that may be under some food stress. There is food stress beyond breakfast, but at least we can get them focused and on learning. And we also are very well aware that the schools managing these issues on the front line, they do make some calls around additional food supply and support into those. So those schools are a great connector to other services and groups from government and not-for-profits to help support families with issues outside of food. But food, what blows me away in terms of what we do when we look at the education, so many households don't actually appreciate how easily they can put together really cost-effective meals and nutritious meals and get past the hurdle of, but my son or daughter is a picky eater. And out of all the programs we do for our food sensations programs across the state, there is an awful lot of feedback and evidenced engagement on massive shifts households make on how to bring a child into decisions for nutritious food and away from food that is not good for them. So we'd love to do a lot more in educating parents and adults on top of the school education program, so that we're empowering people to make really good decisions about how to buy good food. And we're not just talking buying the food we provide, we're talking back into the normal economy, but they have long-term understanding of how to buy good food, how to plan for great meals, and how to eat well together because of the proven mental health and physical health impacts of it. So we've got a great food supply. We'd love to do more across the state, but we deal with those under stress. The education program, that really helps anybody who's unsure about how to bring great meals together, and we get it from all sorts of socio-demographic profiles, and we'd like to keep that going. So we've got some risks in that area, and we'd love a bit more government support to do it, but you know, we'd love to work more with the government, and the government does already do a lot. So it's the weaving in with the very complex network of all the not-for-profits. We deal with 448 not-for-profits. We've had the privilege of recently getting to know communities a bit better through some of our other activities, and there are so many more out there. So there's a lot of connection to make, and together all the services can get the result. We just need to do a bit more collaboration and conversation to ensure great food hits the table for all West Australians, because look, we're a great state. Imagine what we could do if everyone's eating well and able to be their very best.
Thanks, Kate. I think she just made a pitch, Mike, but I'm not going to let you respond to it now. We haven't got enough time. You can do that offline. Our next question is from Lacey Philpich from Money School. She says, I have only read the executive summary of the report, but didn't see a recommendation on a universal basic income UBI trial. Do the panellists see a UBI like that proposed by Professor Ross Garnaut in his book Reset, a solution worth considering to the poverty we are seeing? I'm going to direct that to you, Cassandra. That sounds like a question you'd be all over.
Great, thanks, Jane. And but just on the food question, I also think it's what's really important in the analysis that's coming through from all these reports is that by and large, that because of the housing costs and the inadequate income, food has become a discretionary item, which is a shameful situation for us to have allowed people to find themselves in. And so again, that focus on income and on dealing with the housing costs is so crucial, Kate, isn't it, to making sure that as much as possible people have autonomy and they can shop like everybody else, you know, in the supermarkets and in the markets and all the rest of it. I think the debate about the universal basic income, and Jane, I want to acknowledge you have been an ongoing fantastic supporter of the Raise the Rate campaign. At the heart of the Raise the Rate campaign has been exactly as Alan's talked about as well, others, about lifting up the adequacy of the rates of income support, job seeker, Commonwealth rent assistance to something which is universally adequate. And what we're calling for is essentially a universal payment, whether you're an older person or a younger person, that is enough for you to live out of poverty. And then the debate that becomes something that we do need to look at again is the conditions for getting that payment. There are some who say everybody, including Gina Reinhardt, West Australian, should get the universal basic income. I'm not of that view. I think it should be targeted to people, but it should be universally adequate. And we also have to seriously look again at the kind of conditions, because, do you know, right now, if you fall into being without a job and you are requiring, you know, to rely on Social Security, the compliance obligations are horrific. They actually make people sick, because you're applying for jobs after jobs. You're in a digital system, Jane. You can't get to speak to a human being. Remember, when it used to be human services, it's not very human anymore. And so that is one of the reasons many people actually say it's so toxic that it's actually a barrier to me getting ahead to be able to find paid work. Well, one of the big things that we've heard during that 2020 period, when we did show we could end poverty when we want to, was from health organisations, from others directly affected. Many people in the Raise the Rate campaign have spoken about their experience, was that they finally actually had in the jargon, the bandwidth to get out of crisis and actually do what they needed to do to get their education, to retrain and to get out there and be competitive in a very complex labour market about where you're going to find yourself a job if you need to be looking for paid work when you're 55 years of age and you've got to retrain, right? You don't need to be turning up to a job active provider every week explaining. You need to be able to get out there and just have the headspace to do it. So I think that's really important that we look again at the conditionality of Social Security, no question. It needs to be something where it feels safe and you feel supported, so that you then are able to do what you need to do to be out there trying to get a job, you know, for as long as you're able to.
Yes, there's a lot of comment I've heard too about how cruel the both the finding a job system is, but also Centrelink can feel to people who are already feeling very vulnerable. And as my friend put it to me, which is still breaking my heart, broken. There's a lot of shame attached to feeling.
I was just going to say, Jane, you know, one of the most important things we've also seen through this period as communities is that we've seen on a grand scale, so many people experiencing losing your job. People are losing their job today. They're losing their jobs every single day. And we've created this stigma of shame about it historically, that somehow it's shameful to you to be needing to go to Centrelink. It should not be. We should be proud of the fact that we have a social security system, but we need to have a social security system we can be proud of. And I want to thank all the people on low incomes who have had that experience. So many older women, Jane, you know, who've been in the media telling this story. Let's break the silence on this, because it's through that power of all the work that's being done by people on this panel and people directly affected, speaking to other people who are worried they might be, that I think we'll win this. And we can afford to do it. My last thing I just want to highlight, when everybody says, oh, this all sounds great, but won't it be really expensive? Can I highlight that those tax cuts that are going to cost the budget about $30 billion per annum, Mike. The federal government spending $30 billion per annum on tax cuts, many of which are going to high income, mostly men who've already got jobs who probably don't need the money and they know it. Speak up if you're one of them. Tell the politicians, don't worry about some of those tax cuts. Give it to people who actually will spend it, who really need it, so that they can look after themselves and their kids. Thanks, Jane.
Thank you, Cassandra. Now, I'm afraid we've come to our last question. Even though there's plenty more coming in, we don't have time, tragically. And this question is from Mark Robinson, Institute for Social Science Research, UQ, and he asks, free childcare was another policy response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Yes, excellent. Do panel members think that free, universal, high-quality childcare might contribute to reducing income poverty and income inequalities? Lynn, you haven't answered a question. Maybe I'll give you and Mike a go at this one briefly because time is running rapidly past. Go first, Lynn.
Sure. Well, briefly, yes. Yes, it would make a big difference.
Yes, you're right. Mike, do you want to? Good on you, Lynn.
I don't think I can dispute that it probably would make a big difference. Yeah, that's probably my sense of it as well.
So I can expand a little bit on my response if you want. It'll make a really big difference because for many women, that they just can't afford childcare in any way, shape or form. So there's a lot of informal childcare that is sort of put together with bits of sticky tape and string. It's not ideal for children and it's not ideal for the mum who then is worried about her kid. You know, how's grandma going? How's the aunt going? How's my friend going? So free, accessible and high quality childcare will help in two main ways. It will help women reattach to the labour market in a way they can focus or they can skill up and get better jobs, lifting themselves and their children out of poverty. And they can, the children themselves in high quality, developmentally appropriate childcare will actually not be falling behind. They'll be scaffolded and be able to do much better in school. And so they won't fall behind. They'll be able to get better jobs as well. So I think it's just a lay down misère. That's a great idea. And, you know, again, these are all things we can afford if we want to. So to Cassandra's $30 billion of tax cuts, I'll put in hundreds of billions of dollars for submarines that don't come for decades and that we change our minds about. So there's a lot of ways in every federal budget and every state budget. You look at state budgets, look at roads and where they're built, look at where tracts of housing developments happen and where they're from. So I think if we actually all start voting and talking to our elected representatives or people who'd like to be our elected representatives about where they're going to spend their money, what their expenditure priorities are, we'll get a real sense of, you know, where we want to vote, or whether our priorities are tax cuts to wealthy men or free and accessible childcare for women and children, for example. I know how I'll be voting.
To your hundreds of billions for submarines and your tax cuts, Cassandra, I'll throw in a few billions given to high fee, high resourced private schools. That should cover a fair bit of free childcare, I would have thought, and maybe even some Commonwealth rent assistance money as well. It's easy enough to think of the stupid places we're putting some bucks and the much more sensible places we could put them. We are just about out of time. So I have to now say thank you for our panellists and the wonderful, wonderful insights they offer us and the work they do. I mean, you know, it's bloody hard advocating for people who fall into poverty in this country. There is a lack of sympathetic ears amongst many in the powerful. Obviously, Mike is an exception to that, and there are some great exceptions all over the place, but a lot of very closed ears, which would be a great thing to see those open. I wish we had more time to talk about this, but at the moment we don't. And I think we need to say the full report is on the Bankwest Curtin Economics Centre website, so please go to that at bcec.edu.au. The thing that I take out of having listened to what everyone's been saying is the sense of shame that attaches to poverty, which is and the stigma. And I think that that is one of the blockages. It makes it hard for people to advocate for themselves because they are pretending that they're not as desperate as they are. I've been confided in many times, often by older women, who never thought they'd find themselves in the situation they're in, and their stories are heartbreaking, and the tears in their eyes as they tell me is even more heartbreaking. And for everyone in poverty, I urge you, you have nothing to be ashamed of. You've done nothing wrong. You have simply come across misfortune, which is part of the great risk we all take by being alive. Life's chancy. Please tell us your stories. Tell us your truth. We want to hear it. We need to hear it. Thanks again to our speakers today, to Alan and the team for doing the report, to you, our audience, for joining us. It's been my absolute pleasure to explore this important research with you. And I hope we're all coming away from today with a better understanding of the issues and what we urgently need to do to address them. Thank you again for joining us. Thanks for Cassandra for throwing herself off a plane and sitting on the ground at Perth Airport. I think that's fantastic. And to all the other panellists too for coming from wherever they are across the interwebs. Thank you so much. Goodbye.